there's a question behind this objection, right? For me, objections are just questions. Somebody's asking for more information about something, right? And your job is you got to discover what that question is that you need to answer.
Absolutely. I call that the intent. I give the analogy, I call it the objection handling iceberg. What people say is just the tip. So for example, if I said, oh, it's too expensive, like think about all the different permutations of too expensive you can come up with. Like, what does that even mean?
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was David Priemer. He's the author of a new book titled Sell the Way You Buy, a modern approach to sales that actually works, even on you. And he's joining me today on Sales Enablement, episode 772, to talk about how salespeople can arm themselves to succeed with progressive strategies for connecting with the modern buyer. We'll dig into why so many sellers find themselves executing tactics they sense are outdated, ineffective, and inconsistent with their personal philosophy. We're also going to dive into why so many sellers are what David calls unconscious sellers, and what he's identified as the biggest barrier to salespeople in changing their behaviors. Now, before we get to David, I want to let you know that the whole team of people who work to produce this podcast are incredibly grateful for all of you who support us by listening to the show, telling your friends, sharing it on social media, and most importantly, subscribing to the show and giving us your feedback in the form of a rating and review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. You're joining us from where today?
From beautiful Toronto, Canada. You'll be able to tell by my accent. I say process and project and stuff.
You do.
So
you do, yes. Well, that's okay. So how are things in Toronto? You guys all shut down like we are here, or?
Oh yeah, we're all living our best lives in isolation here for sure. No, it's quiet, it's nice. It's funny, the way I've kind of been describing it to people is when my first child was born. She was born at 6 o'clock in the evening, and then I remember it was I was staying in the hospital with my wife, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, that same day. And she starts crying. And I thought to myself, is this how it's going to be from now on? Is she's going to wake up and cry? Is this how it's going to be? And I feel like we all kind of went through that a few weeks ago when, everyone's locked down and we're like, oh, is this the way it's going to be? And now I actually feel people are getting used to it a little bit. What are you finding?
Yeah. It's very quiet here in New York City. But yeah, we have kind of a small apartment that was really meant to be sort of a second home, because we're in the process of moving from New York to San Diego, and this is going to be a place we come back and stay when we visited. Instead, we're locked up in it, and tight. It's a little tight quarters, as I was saying. My wife, who's a professor and an associate dean at NYU School of Medicine, is holding meetings and teaching classes from our bathroom while I'm recording, because my studio's out in the main part of the apartment. So yeah, she's being a very good sport about the whole thing.
Well, you know what? I think that this, and this will be interesting to see kind of obviously how it plays out over time and all the lessons that we've learned as a society. But at least the nice thing is, as I've been kind of continuing my business and doing Zoom meetings and the whole bit, and you see, people that have kids draped all over them, and cats are on their head, and they're in bed because they actually only have a studio apartment and don't have a couch. It's actually quite humanizing, I feel, all of these great stories. So that's, I don't know, maybe a bright spot that's coming out of it.
Yeah. Well, we joke because we do have what we call the gym, which is where our Peloton is located. and then, it's we sort of make believe and fantasize that we're actually back at our place in San Diego, which is substantially larger and has rooms you can walk into. So someday we'll get there. Yeah, this too shall pass, as we said. So tell us a little bit about you, David. So what was your first job in sales?
Yeah, I mean, like most people who end up in sales, I had never intended to end up in this great profession. I ended up here by accident, like everyone else. So I actually started my career as a research scientist, and I got into sales at the turn of the dot-com boom. So kind of 1999, 2000, when everything was just exploding. And I joined a little startup here in Toronto. There were 20 people at the time as a sales engineer. And a shout out to all the great sales engineers out there listening,
Yes.
we all know who closes these deals. At the end of
That's
the
right.
day,
Ones that really close the deal. Yes.
That's right. And so I started as a sales engineer, this small company, which basically meant like we did everything. We did the demos and the custom config, and I had been a coder in my research scientist days, building computer models. So it was kind of normal for me to do coding and that kind of stuff. But absolutely kind of fell in love with sales, because to me, sales turned out to be a bit of like an engineering problem. Not that it's all science by any stretch. I mean, there's certainly a huge human element, but there was, kind of winning and losing. And when I said it like this way, the customer understood it. When I said like that way, like it went over their head. So that's kind of how I got my start in sales. And we actually grew that company from about 20 people to 700 people. And it turned out to be $100 million business. And we IPO'd and got acquired several years later. And I just got absolutely hooked.
What was the name of that company?
Company was called WorkBrain, based in Toronto. It was a enterprise workforce management software company. So we did basically scheduling, time tracking, payroll calculations for very big companies, retailers, banks, airlines, that kind of stuff.
So if you had to say, okay, there was one person that really was sort of responsible for teaching me how to sell, who was that big influence on you?
What? I'd say one of let's say the biggest and consistent influences in my sales career was actually the fellow who brought me into WorkBrain in the first place, a fellow by the name of David Stein, who I'm still good friends with today. He was one of the co-founders of the company, scarcely a little bit older than I was at the time, 25-year-old kind of kid being shoved in there. And yeah, I mean, he was one of these, what you call kind of like natural sellers, just, high conviction, super smart. He was actually turned out to be then the CEO of the third startup that I was a part of when I joined. There was just 5 of us, and we ended up being acquired by Salesforce. We worked at Salesforce together. And so he continues to be a good friend and mentor.
Okay. So you've had this successful career before starting your own thing, worked for Salesforce for a long time. What's your sales superpower?
So my sales superpower is what I refer to as synthesis. And not being prepared for this question, but it's actually a question I would often ask candidates when I would hire them. Say, like, what's your superpower? Like, what's the thing that you're just really good at compared to everyone else? Or put it another way, the thing that when we look back months from now and you're an amazing success in the sales profession, we're going to say to ourselves, of course, Andy was going to be great at sales. He told us this was his superpower. So my superpower, I refer to as synthesis, which is the ability to kind of take complex topics and kind of boil them down with, examples and make them very relatable. And that's what I had to do, of course, as a research scientist and then a sales engineer. And, even today, a lot of the research that I do and the things that I teach come from just, oftentimes like scientific research, but also life examples that you apply to selling, because sales is all around us. So that's the superpower. It's called synthesis.
No, I like that. Yeah, I oftentimes use that term myself when people ask me that question, but slightly different, which is the ability to synthesize a number of different inputs from the customer and come up with a solution that was unanticipated.
That's true. Being able to, to your point, like to listen, and it's almost like not even just the solution, it's the problem. Sometimes people come to us and they're not even really clear what the problem is. And we help, just like think about it like a good doctor, like who asks you, is the pain more of like a shooting pain or a dull pain? And you're like, well, actually, now that you mention it, right? But you wouldn't have come up with that synthesis all on your own.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about your book, which you're just published, called Sell the Way You Buy, A Modern Approach to Sales That Actually Works. So there's an implication in there that most of what you might read about sales or people advocate as a way to sell actually doesn't work. Is that sort of did I read that correctly?
You could certainly interpret it that way. Yes.
It can be controversial and say that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's not that everything that we do in sales is categorically ineffective. However, there are tactics which, let's say, salespeople have been taught over the years, which have now been scientifically proven to be ineffective in a sales context.
Like what?
So, for example, often referred to as, let's say, closing tactics, right? So imagine you're talking to a customer and, as a salesperson, you're trying to kind of, kind of close off all the angles, right? Like you want to kind of box your customer into the sale because you don't want them to kind of wiggle out. And so you're having this conversation and you say, Andy, do you think there's any reason why you don't think we could get a deal done today? Right. And these are called closing tactics. And we taught people how to do this, right? Is there any reason?
That's not past tense. They're still being taught.
Oh, this is the problem, Andy. You're absolutely right. And the reason is, it's funny, like the way I actually describe like why this is such a problem. It's literally on page 1 of the book. The first chapter is called the Cobra Kai paradox. And for those listeners who are
Karate Kid,
Karate Kid reference, right? And the idea behind sales is that we don't teach sales in school. There are actually, I think I referenced, over 4,000 post-secondary, institutions in the U.S. and only about 100, 150, 200 or so have anything to do with teaching sales. And so the way we learn sales is just by the sensei, like the people who taught us, right? And then they learn it from the people who taught them. So this is this great profession that's, the lore and the tactics have been passed down. But a lot of times these things get passed down from time to time without due consideration for how people actually buy and how that's changed, and whether there's new evidence to support the fact that those tactics do or do not work. And so that's kind of how we end up, if I can say, like in a bit of a mess. As you say, people still execute those tactics. But to your question about, which tactics no longer work, that's an example. Like these closing tactics, when you
did they ever
work? Well, whether they worked or not, like people did them and people still teach them, right?
Well, but I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about sales is, and I was just writing about this, is there's this law of supply and demand that's just broken in sales. And I sort of phrase it this way, is that buyers have a high demand for trusted advisors, we'll put it, right? They've got a low demand for people to be what I call salesy. To your point about these old shop-worn closing techniques. Sellers have a high supply of salesiness and a low supply of being trusted advisors.
Right.
And you would have thought that given the high demand on the part of the buyers for trusted advisors, that the salesiness would have disappeared over time. But it's been amazingly persistent. And I'm so like, well, why has that been the case? I mean, there's a buyer's not saying, please, Andy, love your product, but you're just not salesy enough. Could you be more salesy?
I need you to shoehorn me into this solution and box me in with your clever negotiation tactics.
Well, to that point, I remember my very first sales training class decades ago, watching these videos of this guy named Lee DuBois. And so I was working at that time for a company called Burroughs, second largest computer company in the world at the time. And we were in a training center and watching these videos, and they were talking about handling objections. And the whole way you're supposed to handle the objection was to say, well, just suppose that wasn't a problem for you, Mr. Prospect, right? So you could say, look, I sell cars, I only sell them in blue. And the prospect says, well, I love the car, but I'm only going to buy a red car. You'd handle the objection saying, well, just supposing we made one in red, would you buy it from us? And the guy said, well, sure. Well, I can't make it in red, but I can sell it to you in blue. You already said you like it. I mean, and the fact is, you still hear people doing that today.
Well, that's actually, when used properly, can be a very powerful tactic. In fact, I refer to that tactic in my book in the objection handling chapter as turning the future into the past, which is a term we used to use a lot in my third startup. But this idea of oftentimes when you hear an objection, you're always wondering as a salesperson, what's on the other side of that? Okay, let's say, to your point, let's say we overcame that. What's on the other side? Now, the way you've kind of described it, and if I can call it a more nefarious way, is like being able to box someone into a decision.
Well, right.
Versus being able to use it as an exploratory tactic. Because sometimes when a customer says, it's too expensive, and you say, well, fair enough. What if it was free? Right? Let's overcome that objection. It's not free, but for example, what if it was? You're not actually trying to box them in, because making it free or having the car in red is not something you can do. But what you're trying to do is figure out, okay, what else is there? Is that the only issue, or is that issue masking a bigger issue? And you're telling me it's too expensive because there's actually something bigger at play that we need to address first. So I actually do think it can be a very appropriate discovery tactic for objection handling.
Yeah, but that's the whole point you said, right? You're really trying to do when you're doing is not to box people in, but to say, there's a question behind this objection. right? For me, objections are just questions. Somebody's asking for more information and about something, right? And your job is, you got to discover what that question is that you need to answer.
Absolutely. I call that the intent. And I give the analogy, I call it the objection handling iceberg. What people say is just the tip.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if I said, "Oh, it's too expensive," like think about all the different permutations of too expensive you can come up with. Like, what does that even mean, right? And so it's like the example I give is, let's say I invite you out on a date and you say, what, David, I'm busy Saturday. Well, how do I know do you ever want to go out with me, or are you just going to keep coming up with excuses, or do you have a logistical issue with, that you're busy that day, but another day might work, so I have to keep asking. It's a discussion, right? It's not an interrogation. It's not a one-hit crush, but that's what sales is.
Yeah. Well, I said it's not something to be handled. It's something to be discovered, as you talked about.
Sure.
So, early in the book, you wrote, and you sort of talked about this idea that salespeople find themselves in this dilemma. They're executing, this is a quote, executing tactics they sense are outdated, ineffective, and inconsistent with their personal philosophy. And it seems like increasingly in sales, it's hard to find room for people's personal philosophies.
Well, so when you say you're hard to find room, are you saying like people kind of are very clear on what their personal philosophy is? But
no. The way the sales processes are set up these days is that there's no room for being an individual or developing your own sales philosophy. It's there's sort of one way.
I think, so I agree that, organizations are trying to put together, these sales processes and playbooks to be able to, ramp and onboard reps effectively, especially young, sales reps who, again, receive no formal training in sales. And so they're just looking to the organization. But I think a lot of it has to do with, what I talk about is execution. Like I can give you a tactic and teach it to you and write it down in a playbook. But the way you execute that tactic, like the tone, right, the kind of the pacing of your words, has a huge impact on how the customer will perceive it. And so, I think when we think about like what is our own personal philosophy, that's kind of where the two intersect. So, if I were to give you an example, a tactic that we often would use, especially at Salesforce, was a reverse psychology tactic, if I can call it that. And I talk about this in the book as well. So let's say the customer says, hey, look, Salesforce really love your product, but Microsoft is half the price. Like you're double the price of Microsoft. So we would train our sales reps to challenge the customer and basically kind of uncover the reasons why they may or may not decide to go with Microsoft. And so the words, why don't you go with Microsoft, can be said in all sorts of different ways and tones, right? That may or may not align with your philosophy. So for example, if you're trying to challenge the customer directly, you might say, well, why don't you just go buy Microsoft then? Right? In a very like kind of antagonistic way, right? Versus if you do it more in like an inquisitive way, like I'm curious, like, Microsoft is a good company. If I'm you, like maybe I should go that route. Like why might you not go with Microsoft? Right. And so the question is, do people feel that they have the liberty to kind of enact their own kind of personality and tone through their tactics? Or are they being told, or they feel they're being told to execute those tactics in a certain way? It's kind of like the Karate Kid, like sweep the leg, just sweep the leg. Right? Maybe there's a better way.
Well, but the feeling you get from, I get from talking to salespeople and to looking at the research and studies that come out about this as well, is increasingly they sort of feel like it's being dictated to them. And I contrast it with my own experience coming up in sales is that in retrospect, looking at what I see happening so often now, is I feel incredibly fortunate to have grown up with managers that gave me enough rope to hang myself.
Mm-hmm. Well, so if what you're saying is true, which, very well could be that, hey, look, there are some organizations, and that hasn't been my experience where, it's kind of very directive in terms of how people should behave. But if that's the case, then what it means is that, yes, there's a ton of people out there that are going and executing tactics that in the back of their mind, they're thinking to themselves, like, this is not me. Like, this is not how I would behave in normal everyday life had I been not sitting in my sales seat. And it's almost like they're kind of whipping out their sales badge, like their FBI badge. Like, excuse me, sir, I'm in sales here. I'm just going to treat you like a jerk for the next half hour, but it's okay. I'm in sales. Like, being in sales does not give you the right to treat people poorly. And to be honest, when you start behaving in a way that is inconsistent with how you are as a person, it creates a big ego strain that actually hinders your ability to be successful in selling.
Yeah, well, so let's pursue that a little bit further because there's research showing that sales performance sales is falling in general in B2B sales over the last 7 years, I think now. And granted, it's somewhat it's not a rigorous scientific study, but it's a survey of a broad number of companies and the other data points. And yet, at the same time, when we've had a sort of great influx of technology into sales, is how do we? What's going on? I mean, what if not that people aren't being encouraged or developed to be their best sales selves? What's happening? What's accounting for that?
So, like, why is sales getting harder?
I don't know if it's getting harder. What we're seeing is the data saying that we're performing less well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a few factors. I mean, the average tenure and age of a sales rep is decreasing, right? So people are staying in their roles for less time. They're much younger, especially in kind of the and this is more like a tactical, for those listening, kind of like a tactical hiring thing, that in the key markets like let's say the New York, Chicago's, San Francisco, Atlanta's, like these big markets. It's getting more expensive to hire salespeople, and you're actually getting less for more. You're paying more money for a younger salesperson, which is why you see actually a lot of people hiring in some of these secondary markets. But in addition to kind of the age and tenure decreasing, I mean, that's just on the sales side. On the buying side, things have changed quite dramatically. So there are like a million different, I'd say, exaggerate, but like, for example, a million, like there's so many different solutions out there. Like the barrier to create a solution for someone to buy or a product, and this is great for entrepreneurs, has never been lower. It's so easy to come up with a solution. And so if you, for example, and these are well quoted stats, but I talk about it in the book. If you're looking for like a marketing technology platform, in 2011 there were 150 vendors, and in 2019 there were over 7,000. And while you are one of those vendors, and you might think you're this unique, delicate snowflake, to your customers, you just all sound the same. You all sound the same, right? For everything that we do, I train salespeople, you run a podcast, there's a million people that do what we do. And it's actually very hard for people to understand the nuance, especially when everyone kind of says the same thing. So we end up kind of falling into the sea of sameness, which makes it even harder for the salesperson to kind of, breach the defenses of so you're taking a younger, less experienced salesperson to breach the defenses of a customer that is more peer-driven, more skeptical, harder to reach than ever before in a sea of a million solutions. That's why you're seeing what you're seeing.
Well, so let's explore this idea about being younger, because what do you mean when they're younger? I mean, everybody starts at some point, right?
It's true. There's a concept I talk about in the book and talk about a lot called experience asymmetry. And this is kind of where it came out of. Most salespeople, I know there are exceptions, but I'm going to make a blanket statement here. Most salespeople have never done the job of the person that they're calling on. That
always been true. Yes.
Always been true, right? So we're calling on people whose job we've never done. At the same time, salespeople are told to call high, right? Like call high, call the CEO, call the VP, call the CLO. We're told to call high. So we have all these like younger, I'm not saying everyone's young, but just on the whole, like we're younger, less experienced sales reps calling on more senior level decision makers whose job we've never done. And how this manifested for me, and I would see this a lot, like one of the great things about working at Salesforce, and my company was acquired by Salesforce, that's how I ended up working there, but I had a 5-year career there that was amazing. The team was great, the environment was great, and one of the things I really enjoyed was just the availability of data. Like you're able to see data at scale that you can't see at a smaller company. And I used to manage teams out of a bunch of cities, including New York. Where you are. And the thing I loved about my teams in New York, and shout out to all my New York sales reps if you're listening, is just the hustle, right? Like the whole pace at which they work is amazing. And they make lots of calls, lots of emails, and lots of activity. But sometimes you would get reps that would have actually quite a lot of activity and very little pipeline. So I would start to listen to I'm like, I don't know what you have enough people to call? They say, yeah, we got enough people to call. Like, are you making enough calls? They're making enough calls. They're calling at the right time of day. So I'm like, okay, I just got to listen to your calls now. Like let's hear the recordings and see what I hear. And what I would hear is in the voices of these younger sales reps is fear. Like if I were to close my eyes and just listen to the recordings of these sales reps, I would close my eyes and I would say, it sounds to me like you're bothering them. Like that's what it feels like. It feels like you're afraid that you're not adding enough value. So you're like, what's the word I'm looking for? You're tentative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're
Mm-hmm.
not coming off with the conviction you need because you're thinking in the back of your head, who is this senior person and why would they listen to me? And you know what? That's exactly what they're thinking. Who is this kid and what are they going to teach me about running my business? And so like that conviction and that experience asymmetry is a huge factor, right, in our ability to convert customers. And it's one of the challenges I had early in my career as a sales engineer. I was 25 going into these boardrooms of like United Airlines and Citibank and so on.
Sure.
So why would they listen to me?
Well, but the point I was trying to get to is you're talking about younger or so you're saying is that they're being promoted into more responsible sellers are being promoted into more responsible positions earlier than in previous eras?
Well, so what I'm saying is, as a younger seller, like you don't have the experience in the chair to know what the person you're calling on cares about and does every day.
I was just trying to understand whether you think that's different now than it was, 10, 20, 30 years ago, which to me, that's why it seems like it's the same.
It's similar. I mean, the average age of the sales reps is decreasing and the tenure is decreasing. So for example, if I was 25 years old or 30 years old, let's say, but I had been working at the same company for several years and understood their products and services and customer, landscape very intimately, I'd be in totally fine shape. But if I'm moving jobs every 18 months, I'm not building up enough tenure. And there's actually some really interesting research that shows that, the difference between spending, let's say, 18 months versus 24 months at a company can be quite big in terms of your ability to convert customers and be successful. So I think you're right that, the average age is getting younger. That hasn't changed. But also on the buying side, and I'm not saying executives are getting older, and so that divide is getting bigger. But, again, in a sea of similar sounding solutions and a million different, options out there, the ability to kind of ignore sales reps is almost a required defense mechanism for many customers, right? They need to do that to survive. And I think that's one of the things that's changed a lot.
Yeah. I wonder whether the problem is, I don't say different, but I mean, there's a component to it, which I think doesn't get spoken enough about. And you address it somewhat when you're talking about, I've never been in that CEO's shoes. But one thing that seems to be almost completely absent from the way that we educate sellers, because, to your point early on, very little education at the secondary level, right? So basically, we're teaching people on the job. Is we don't teach them about business. So the ability to even have an understanding of what the CEO is doing is, well, if they're not sitting there and reading it on their own, it doesn't exist. And learn. I mean, so this to me, this is the big disconnect, right? Gartner studies 80% of CEOs find no value in their interactions with sales reps. Well, yeah, let's start there. It's because they just don't understand the business.
There's definitely a component of not understanding the business. I actually kind of go a little bit to the side of that, where I talk about this concept of value, because this idea of like value and ROI, like what's the value to the business? It's like, okay, if I'm talking to a CEO, what does a CEO care about? And we think, oh, it's stock price, shareholder value, and employee satisfaction, all these kinds of things. And some of these things might have ROI to them. Hopefully, a lot of them do. And as salespeople, we're told sell value, sell value, sell value, which really what our leaders are telling us is sell the business value. If you spend money with my company, you will either make this much money or you will save this much money. That's the value. But the reality is people make decisions in our lives for all sorts of reasons. And most of them, almost all, have to do with feelings, not necessarily business ROI. And so the question of like selling value has to do with the discretionary feeling that your buyer has towards your product or service, which may or may not have anything to do with ROI. And so, to get into the heads of these CEOs and leaders or whoever you're selling into, it's important to understand that there's a huge difference between the business impact that whatever you're selling can have, and the kind of discretionary feeling that it imparts, because that's what people are buying.
Well, and you left off, I think, perhaps the most important part of the discretionary feeling, which is the discretionary feeling about you.
Right. Well, certainly, like if you might love my product, but if you hate dealing with me, I ain't getting the sale.
Exactly.
Right? And on the flip side, you might actually, and this you see this a lot, right? And especially in the startup world, where your product doesn't work, surprise, surprise, exactly how the customer hoped it would. Shocking. But you know what? They believe in you. They believe in your company. They believe in your mission. And so they're going to give you a second chance. Right? Sometimes I'll even ask, and I believe we're all in sales. So I actually work with a lot of certainly salespeople, but a lot of customer success and account managers and people that are responsible for renewals. And I say to them, has anyone here ever saved a deal, saved a churn, a customer from churning, for the sole reason that it just came down to them? The customer didn't cancel their subscription because I was so good and made them feel so good about doing business with us again. And hands go up, right? Despite the kind of the business value, people are still buying into the kind of that personal belief.
Well, so the question would be, do you think they were right?
Do I think the customers were right to buy
No,
into the people?
do you think the reps were right to say, yeah, they stayed because of me?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
I do too. I just interested in the two parts.
I appreciate you challenging me on that. No, look, there's lots of times, and you see this all over the place. Like and I saw this actually quite a lot at Salesforce, where you would have a territory that had been statistically and historically underserviced. Like, why can we not crack Raleigh, North Carolina? I don't understand. Like, what's going on in Raleigh, North Carolina? And there's been no rep that's been able to be successful there. And then what happens is the chosen one comes, like the Neo, the chosen one comes along, and all of a sudden they have success in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it's like, well, how did you do that? Right? And a lot of times it was just different tactics, different personality, different tone, approach. Some people, some people just have it. It does oftentimes come down to like that person.
Well, I mean, you wrote about this specifically in the book. Quote is, you say, what is truly amazing is that when it comes to converting prospects into customers, even the smallest and seemingly insignificant parts of our sales motion can inspire that sense of conviction and safety. And yeah, I call that the 1% difference. Is you only have to be 1% better in some dimension. And it's not even really clear what that dimension is. There's a study published, 6-7 years ago in the Harvard Business Review that two professors talking about what they call tie-breaking selling. Is that when you have sort of virtually identical products, or perhaps even a commodity market, that it's non-monetary factors that spell the difference. And that could start with the salesperson. I mean, you have to presume in this world, in this time and day and age, that oftentimes you're competing against products that are virtually identical to yours, offer virtually identical benefits and ROI to the customer. What spells that difference? Well, I think it starts with the person.
Absolutely, it does. No, absolutely, it does. To your point, all the products to our customers kind of sound the same. And I often actually talk about sales as like we're the audition for the company. Like, if I can use
Absolutely.
the phrase tip of the spear, first experience. And in fact, I had this discussion with a salesperson. I was looking to get some catering for a sales training event I was running. And so I spoke to the caterer, and I sent them an email, and they said, no problem, David, I'll get you a quote like in a day. And then a week later, I get this note saying, oh, sorry, David, I'm really sorry this fell through the cracks, but no, I'll get you a quote in the next hour. They got me a quote, and it was completely not what I'd asked for. And I said, well, sorry, this is not what I asked for. And they're like, oh, sorry, David, our bad, we sent you the wrong quote. And I'm like, well, it wasn't the wrong quote. It had my name on it and and all my information. And so I kind of just, called the person up. I said, look, this is like an audition. Like, you're trying to provide catering services in hospitality where presentation, it's not the food. The food is probably fine. It's, how do you serve the coffee and tea? It's the presentation's everything. And if this is the audition that I'm getting, I don't have a lot of confidence that this is what, I'm going to get the presentation that I'm after. So yeah, we are absolutely there. We're the audition.
So a couple other points I want to cover while we still have some time to talk is one that, first of all, book, very well done book, very smart. Definitely recommend people read it. Is you talk about this idea of making best guess decisions based on limited amount of information. And isn't that always the case? I mean, that's almost always going to be the case when people make decisions, is they make them on, they're assuming a certain amount of risk in their calculation, but they can never completely know what they're going to get.
Absolutely. Like, people oftentimes think about, to go back to our discussion on ROI, right? And so people say, no, well, in B2B sales and, highly involved technical sales, like we have to put a business case together and we got to, it has to be rigorous and all these kinds of things. And that may be true. But when it comes down to like a business case, the real question is the person that you're presenting this business case to, do they believe it? Do they believe all of the assumptions that you put in? Do they believe that your organization has the capability to deliver on the solution that's going to net out the assumptions that you put in the business case? At the end of the day, it comes down to, I wouldn't say a guess, but like it's a belief. It comes down to a feeling. Either you believe that that company can deliver or you don't. And it's not just about the product. It might be, for example, even like case studies. People ask about, case studies and references. Customer says, can I speak to a reference? Well, I'm not going to put someone in front of you that's going to say bad things. I'm going to get a good.
That's why no one ever calls them.
Well, this is the thing. We always had a joke that, the request for a reference isn't so much that they want to know what the reference says. It's just that if you can produce one at all, right? So so someone was asking me the other day and they said, what kind of case studies and so on are important to have on your website? I'm like, you know what? The idea is like when I go to a client section of a website and I see that there's people saying nice things, it's almost like a checkbox. It's like, all right, good. They have clients that are happy with their solution, right? And it comes down to a feeling. Now, whether I believe those clients are actually happy, becomes, will I be like them? It's an educated guess. And even in our personal lives, if I want to go on vacation and I go on TripAdvisor and I look at the resort in Jamaica that I want to go to and I see, well, like Betty in Des Moines, Iowa gave this place a 5 out of 5, but I'm a Canadian guy with 3 kids and Betty is a retired librarian. I got to take my best guess, and we do this all the time. This is the kind of the heuristic that we apply when we make our decisions.
Well, yeah. But I mean, you talk about these various areas of belief, but really they fundamentally boil down to, do they believe in you? Because you've been the one representing the company and what the product does and what it can accomplish, and you presented the references and so on. I think the too infrequently is sellers aren't conscious of the fact that the question they really need to answer is, why you, right? Why you, David? When you're selling to somebody, that's why should I believe you? Why should I trust you? And you don't have to be the point you make in your book about sellers just don't stop to think about what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Is you got to stop and think about, this is where it all starts. It starts with me, may end with me as well.
Absolutely. It comes down to like a feeling, and that feeling I often describe as conviction or passion. It's sometimes I'll ask people, I say, can you tell that I love what I do? And I'm not fishing for compliments, but can you just tell? And they'll say yes. And I say, well, how do you know? And they say, well, I don't know. You seem like you know a lot about stuff, and you seem very passionate. You quote stuff, and you read a lot. And I'm like, that's true, right? But like, you're not fact checking anything I'm saying, right? It's a feeling you're getting from me, and that feeling is very contagious. The trick is, how do you actually manifest it? A lot of times, if to go back to kind of what you mentioned at the beginning, Andy, is that when we train people and we tell them what to do, they haven't found their own conviction. They're trying to manifest the conviction that their manager just told them to do, and when they do that, it comes off as inauthentic. And anyone who's taken a prospecting call from a telemarketer who is reading from a script knows what that feels like. I often ask people, I say, how long does it take you when a telemarketer calls you and is reading from a script? How long does it take you to tell that's what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, instantly.
And I even give the example of my kids. So my 3 kids right now are 14, 11, and 7 years old. And so I say to people with kids, I say, when your kids come to you and they're about to hit you up for something, like they want permission to download an app or they want to lift somewhere. So can you tell? Like, even before they say anything, they're like, yes, I can. Like, just by the way they approach you, right? Mm-hmm. And so I believe people are very perceptive, especially as it relates to salespeople and the inauthenticity. But to your point, it's the authenticity, it's the passion, it's the conviction, which oftentimes leads to the feelings of belief in the seller and the organization, and ultimately is what converts them.
Yeah, this is a big thing with me and has been for forever. Is sales is a very deliberate act, and I think every step along the way, I sort of rebel against this idea somebody had written once about sellers being unconsciously competent, and it's like, yeah, I understand why you're saying that, but I want people to be in the moment all the time. For me, people I've worked with, that I've seen, that I've coached, that so on, that have been hugely successful in sales, it's not that they're unconsciously competent, it's they're consciously competent.
Absolutely. And I refer to that in the book as unconscious versus conscious sellers, right? And just because you're unconscious, by the way, about what you're doing doesn't mean you're bad. In fact, there's a lot of unconsciously good sellers out there. And
Sure.
I say sellers, you could be a personal trainer or a hairstylist, and you're just good at what you do with lots of conviction. And you don't know why. You've just always been that way. But my point of view is that if you don't know why you're so good, then it means that you could be missing a huge opportunity to be even better. And if you're bad and you don't know why you're so bad, or you're not successful, it's even worse, because not only are you not going to be successful in your sales role, and I say quote unquote sales role because we're all in sales, but you're just going to ruin it for everyone else, right? So that when you tell someone you're in sales, they're not going to want to talk to you anymore. And that's part of my dream, Andy, is that in the future, when you tell someone you're an emergency room doctor, especially now, they're like, oh my God, thank you so much. That's
Yes.
amazing. You tell someone you're in sales, and now you're the enemy for most people, right? For most people, not for those of us in sales who try to do it the best and right way. But just on the whole, when you use, I'm going back to my Dan Pink to Sell as Human, you use the word sales or selling, and 80% of people have a visceral negative reaction to those words.
Yeah, even though he also says that 3/4 of people, white collar workers, presume that influencing others is part of their job now too. So
That's right.
We've met the enemy, and they are us.
Well, that's why sell the way you buy. That's what it's all about, right? Like, we are buyers, and we go through life trying to make purchasing decisions, and the way we buy things is often not clear to us, and yet then we go out, we sell, and we execute completely different tactics and in emotionally different ways. And so that's the object, is to kind of bring it together and sell the way we buy.
Yeah, I mean, and generally, I absolutely agree, right? Because I've done this with clients before, where I was sitting with a client that was raging about some voice tree he got stuck in. He was trying to get customer service at some company, and he's talking about how ridiculous it was and blah blah blah. And I just picked up my phone and dialed his number and gave him an example of his own phone tree, which is horrible. And I've been trying to get him to change forever. And it's like he just had no awareness of that. And that's a perfect example. He wasn't selling the way he wanted to be sold.
That's right. Well, selling the way you want to be sold, there's an empathetic component to it, which is, hey, look, don't use tactics that wouldn't work on you. And so in a way, that's a little easier to come by. And I would often see that, with my reps that would come to me and they say, David, here's this customer. They've kind of gone quiet and gone dark on us, and I'm going to send them this email. I'm hoping it kind of reinvigorates them. What do you think? And I say, I don't know. What do you think? If you're the customer, would you respond to this email, this voicemail, this script? And they would be like, no. Right? So there's an empathy.
Yeah, the empathy thing. I think the big disconnect, though, is that we rarely buy things or products or services of the type that we're selling, in B2B, right? So unfortunately, we're sort of, we're a mix. If Herbert Simon's work about decision makers with maximizers and satisficers, you could be a maximizer that's going to examine every single option to satisfy yourself. You're making the best possible choice, or the satisficer that gathers enough information until they decide, this is the good enough decision. I'll make this, which is what predominantly people are doing when they're making business buying decisions. But the thing is, in our lives, we're both maximizers and satisficers, depending on the decisions we're making. Hey, if I'm buying a piece of business software, I'm probably a satisficer. But if I'm making a decision about life-saving surgery, I'm going to be a maximizer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have this inconsistency within us based on sort of the situations we're in. But to your point that you were making before about, if we have the requisite amount of empathy, then we can sort of work our way through that.
Yeah, I mean, so empathy is a big component. Even if, to your point, even if it's not something that we ourselves would be in a position to buy. And the good thing is, like, if you are a salesperson at a company or you're selling a product that you yourself could be in a position to buy, or at least even use. For example, if you're a sales rep at Salesforce, okay, you're not buying your own software, but you use it every day. So that's powerful. But also, it's kind of like the unconscious bit of it, which is, okay, the way I buy things could be based on, getting a lot of data and research to the point where I feel good. And so, like, maybe that's the kind of feeling that we want to impart to our clients, even though I would not be in a position to buy this particular piece of technology or B2B product myself. I want to make sure you are emotionally comfortable, because that's what I do when I buy things. I want to make sure I'm satisfied, right? So those are the kind of the unspoken sell the way you buy drivers.
Very cool. Well, David, we're out of time, but thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, no, my pleasure, Andy. This is great. Thanks for having me.
It's been a lot of fun. So tell people how they can connect with you and learn more about your book.
Yeah. So the book is called Sell the Way You Buy, and you can find it wherever you buy books, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Indigo, online, and hopefully one day soon in stores again. It's in the store. You just have to be able to go there.
Yeah.
And then, I actually give away a ton of, other than the book, I give away a ton of content for free on my website, which is cerebralselling, all one word, .com, cerebralselling.com. You can also find me on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel called Cerebral Selling as well, but everything is linked to and from the website. You can always hit me up on LinkedIn as well, but those are my coordinates.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much. We'll look forward to having you back on the show.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's a pleasure. Okay,
friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time. I'm so grateful for your support of the show. I'm going to start that again. Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. We're so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank my guest, David Priemer, for sharing his story with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this podcast. And if you could also leave us a review or a rating and let us know how we're doing, well, we'd appreciate it. You can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this podcast is over. So thank you for your help, and thank you so much for investing your time to join me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.